Okay, great. I'll hand over to Mark to talk about how you can influence your local development plan. Thank you.
Okay, I just got to find the presentation. There a minute ago. Not there. There we. If I hit share, it should be there. There we go. Right. Everybody see that? Yeah. Excellent. Okay, let's go to the first slide here now. Okay, afternoon, everybody. Thank you. I'm going to speak for probably about, I think it's 25 minutes or so. So it'll be a relative fly through, but obviously opportunity for questions at the end. As Claire said, my name is Mark Jones. I'm Planning Engagement Officer with Planning Aid Wales. And as Claire's pointed out, we're an independent charity, primarily Welsh Government funded to encourage community engagement in planning. So for today, I'm going to go through 6 topics. As you can see there, a brief introduction, a little bit of an overview, talk about planning policies, primarily LDPs, and conclude with what's our view of how best to get engaged in the LDP process. So part 1, keep on the sides, where do we start? There's challenges to respond in the policy consultations, and how do we respond to make it easier? It seems to be a regular question we get at Planning Aid, be it from community councils, be it from third-party groups who may be looking to make representations, or maybe from others who are trying to promote development. And it's it can be seen as a complex process for those outside the system. So hopefully after today's little talk, we'll all be a little bit perhaps more understanding of the issues and processes involved. So what are the challenges with responding? First one is the what. Understanding the planning system. What is it for? What is relevant? That's the key point to be starting with any input into local development plans. How does it all fit together? As you will probably have experienced, those who've been engaged in the planning system, there can be a number of consultations, and within one consultation, there can be a number of different consultations that filter through to the main consultation. How does that all work together? How long does each last? What does it? And then we come to that point of why. What does it mean to us? What does the community actually want? What does it evoke? I'm using the term community here in a broad sense. It's not looking at a specific village. It could be the development community. It could be the village community. Typical response to get from both sides of the fence is why bother? Will they listen? Frequent. So we're going to hopefully outline today why there is benefits in engaging. Once we've got to that point of engaging, there's 3 other challenges we've identified. Who should deal with writing responses? Who should engage with the LDP consultation? Are they representing the views of that community, that development industry, that development process altogether, or is it an individual's views? So again, it's getting that balance right. How? There's time and resources needed, making sure the responses are right and being able to back them up. And again, at what stage do we respond? When is the response due? Keep it clearly with planning. The one thing, planning can be slow and planning can drag, and a frequent comment to me is why is this process taking long? Why the local authority takes long? Deadlines are set in stone. Miss the deadline and that's the end of the road. So it's important to be sure on those. So we're going to cover those points. As a starting point, as we've said, the key point is to know what's going on in the planning system itself before we can start looking at an individual LDP. So what is planning? I'm sure you're all aware, planning manages the development and the use of land in public interest. Now, I think development and use of land is probably relatively straightforward, although I would emphasize development can be on, over, or under the land. Public interest is the one that generates a lot of controversy and perhaps misunderstanding. It's quite often seen that public interest means, how do we stop it? How do we stop something happening? That's not the case in this definition. Public interest is planning, in the process of planning, is looking wider. So for example, a housing need is maybe in the public interest. Being able to promote the development may well be in the wider public interest. It's not a case that's often seen as, oh, the public interest means we must stop that. We don't want houses. We don't want this. There is a much broader definition when used in planning. I won't dwell on that one because that's just repeating roughly what we said. The key point perhaps to emphasize is planning works within a legal framework and is enforceable by the courts, including the LDP process. So that brings us to much of the meat of what we're going to do today. So the shape of planning. Planning in Wales, probably in its simplest terms, falls into two groups. We've got planning applications, development management, and what we're going to talk about today, planning policy, with the LDP and its associated documents. So we're going to concentrate, and this sounds quite good, on the blue sky bit today. So a little bit of looking rather than the mechanics of a planning application. In Wales, we still and currently have a plan-led system. It's a top-down system. So national policy will steer a local policy. The local development plan then will set local policies. And below that, planning applications will all be determined in accordance with the development plan above. So it's still very much, and what I'm going to explain, because there are changes afoot, or maybe not even afoot, is imminent. And when we come to talk about engaging the LDP soon, there are some changes we'll highlight of what's going on in this plan-led system. But it's very much top-down. Government decides its overarching policy, local authorities set that for their own areas, and then applications determined. So what is national policy? Broadly, the framework is relatively straightforward. We have a national planning policy, comes in two strands these days. We now have Future Wales 2040, which is effectively in the National Development Strategy. It came in this year. We have Planning Policy Wales, which is the government's planning policy document, supplemented by some technical advice notes, which basically beef up the Planning Policy Wales. Below that, this is the new strand that is now rushing in these days, strategic development plans. They fall below the national policy. They filter into local development plans set by the county councils or the national parks, the three national parks. Below that, we can have supplementary planning guidance, which we can also include place plans if they're adopted. So a fairly straightforward policy framework. The importance of emphasizing this is because any engagement within the local development plan has to have regard to those higher levels of planning policy framework. There is no point making representations which fly in the face of those policies above. As we've already identified, national policy delivers the well-being goals, forms local policy, and it informs decision-making, not just policy, but also applications. I'm not going to talk through the numerous pages of Future Wales. That's just to highlight there. When you're looking at any LDP representation, there's the document to start with. It's a broad strategic document. That's the important thing to remember. It's not going to get to the meat of any particular development. Planning Policy Wales puts a bit more flesh because it starts putting individual policies, individual issues. So it gives you a little bit more clout to support, or if there is an opposition to a development, to put forward a reasonable argument. Again, as a slide I'll pass by very quickly in a minute, it's aimed at delivering the well-being objectives from the Future Generations Act. It's impressing the importance of placemaking. Placemaking is the key theme of Welsh planning at the minute. Definition, quite difficult, and it's still being discussed. And it's a bit of a work in progress, but it's the major issue. In my own humble way, planning has always been about placemaking, getting the right development in the right place. And as it there outlines key principles in relation to economy, environment, and the community. Backing up the policy, again, there's a number of technical advice notes. In fact, there's 21 of them, and they cover a range of issues. I'm not going to go through each one. Some are quite dated. In fact, I forget which one it is. One of them is, if you download it off the website, is simply a photocopied few A4 sheets. It's so old. So, but they are still relevant and they still have a bearing. Touching quickly, because if you're going to engage in local development plans, you're going to need very quickly to engage in strategic development plans. These are the new tier that's coming in. They're going to run for a 20-year period. And on the right there, if you can just about see it, you've got 4 regions: North, Mid Wales, Southwest and Southeast. That deals with primarily major strategic cross-boundary issues. So it'll be things like housing, it'll be things like infrastructure, broader issues on environmental designations, but it will take away a fair bit of the LDP once they're adopted. That slide 16, we've already mentioned the Future Generations Act. So should we respond to these national consultations? If you are promoting development, if you've got time, you can, yes. Because by influencing those, even though they may not involve local issues, it can help you be able to put forward a case for any local development. Because if national policy, as I've said earlier, provides a restrictive regime for something, it's going to be much harder to get that pushed through at a local level. So on to the meat of today, LDPs. Why are they important? Apart from the obvious reason of planning applications, they're a framework for development. They protect assets. They're a strategy for investment in infrastructure. That last bit, as I said, with planning applications, they're the primary material consideration. Development should still be in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. Simple meaning, if it's not in the development plan, you're going to have a battle. They cover a number of issues. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just an example. But if you can imagine, this is what the local authority department is trying to put together policies in each of these. And it's quite difficult. And there can often be conflict to achieving something in relation to environment and housing, brings in that balanced judgment. That's just to give you an idea of the broad range of issues they deal with. So an LDP will contain, it's got policies, it's got a vision, strategic policies. They're very broad. It's a sort of little bit of apple pie. It sets out what the local authority we want in. So it'll be, we want to encourage jobs, we want housing, we want to protect the environment, we want sustainable development. What we will see an awful lot more of in the replacement plans is we want to see a carbon neutral society. We want to see climate change addressed. There's going to be that broad brush. It then breaks down to specific policies. So the LDP will then come down to policies on specific housing sites, specific housing categories, amongst other types of development. That's just an example of a policy. Anybody who's not seen an LDP, that just gives you a typical idea. Policies tend to be criteria-based, can be negative or positive. Generally, the encouragement is more positive, i.e. development will be allowed if you comply with, but it can be the other way around, that development won't be supported unless. So there's a key bit there is to look at the policies and look at the criteria, because the initial sentence, the initial intro, I think, great, that supports me, but then you'll see a range of criteria which will either put additional hurdles or may undermine the particular development you're looking at. I'm just going to quickly show this because we're going to look at this in a bit more detail in a minute. The Ldp process goes around from an evidence base, delivery agreement, pre-deposit consultation, deposit plan, examination, inspector's report, adoption. This is why it takes 3 to 4 years by the time this works its way through the system. You can see from the red arrows, those are the times that people can engage. Or I would question the one about the examination, as I'll explain in a second. At examination, it's an independent inspector who will be looking at representations and the plans. It needs to be, is the plan sound? And those are the 3 key tests that the inspector looks at. Ldp Lite will be the new one that comes in. If you have an adopted STP, a local authority can adopt an Ldp Lite, which can be a smaller, briefer document, but it won't need to include housing or the big strategic issues that it does now. Key point there on a consultation engaging is there is no preferred strategy. So there's no initial consultation for an Ldp Lite. It'll go straight from evidence-based straight through to a deposit plan to be examined. Should we respond to LDPs? Yes, and as early as possible. There's an increased understanding of the planning system, of your issues, with an early ongoing engagement, in our view, increases your influence in considering that LDP. I'm not going to talk too much. I'm going to flip past supplementary guidance. Time-wise, They'll be on the slides. The slides are available if anybody wishes them. So engaging in the process. I'm just going to spend 10 minutes now of my talk giving our advice of how we think you engage in the process. It's not set in stone, and as I said, this is just something we as officers in planning aid advocate as our approach. So tip one, you've got to get in early. There is a difficulty. Getting in early can sometimes feel like you've put the cart before the horse, and authorities will come back and sort of say, well, hang on, we don't know all these factors, you're asking us to look at this site. That needs to be overcome, because the earlier the engagement, the better. We just showed you this a few seconds ago. That's the best time to get involved. When the authority are looking at the evidence base on producing their LDP, they'll be collecting information, they'll be looking at sites, they'll be inviting what's called candidate sites that they consider to be included. If there's a scheme you have in mind, this is the time. Early engagement with the local authority here, discussions with the authority, input in that, because it's much easier if the authority back what you're trying to do and include within their plan and their drafts. It's much easier. Fighting the plan is nigh on impossible these days, particularly the way it's structured in relation to being sustainably sound, rather than simply we've got a better site than the one you're listing. So getting at this early stage is the best advice we would give to anyone. If you can't get in there, at least be in before preferred strategy. Preferred strategy is just that initial consultation. So again, there's an opportunity to influence it. So that is a reasonable time to get in. As we move around, irrespective of the blue arrows to a degree, I think the blue arrows probably should have thickness to emphasize the importance of their times, in my view. Once you've gone past preferred strategy to deposit, which is the plan that goes before the inspector to consider an examination, your time to influence is less. The document's becoming set in stone, and unless the inspector finds it flawed, that's how it's going to turn out. At examination and inspector's report, way too late to get involved. It's all over. Once the inspector's report is out, the inspector's report is binding in Wales, the plan will move to adoption. So the emphasis is, far too often I hear from groups I speak to going, well, we waited till we read the deposit plan, and then we thought, yeah, too late. It's about being proactive. It's about getting in between evidence-based and preferred strategy. That's where you're going to have the biggest influence. That's just some authorities that's just picking up on powers, where they were looking for issues to come forward. Powers is one of the more recently adopted ones. So this is really early. They've even looked at what could happen next. But again, if you're keeping on board with the local authority, if that's the case, even if they've just adopted a new plan and you're looking at the next plan, get in straight after it. There's a time lapse of engaging. The sooner you're involved, the better. Tip 2, keep it relevant. Know what your proposal is. Know what the issue is. Have the nuts and bolts in place. Not simply coming forward and going, oh, well, I've got a bit of land looking for housing. Have something in mind. If we're looking at community housing schemes, have that case beginning to build that you can be aware what you're going to argue. Build in that policy structure. So be referring back to any national strategic or even previous local development plans to that degree, any supplementary plan. It's to support your case. So it's doing the homework to put together this policy structure to what you're trying to do. It's not just, we think this would be a good idea and it can bring these benefits. Be able to argue, this fits the policy that the government is trying to review. This fits the policy that the new regional structures are going to try and promote. So have a grasp of those policies, which is why I briefly mentioned them earlier. It's important to be aware of what's in those to support any representation, any engagement into the LDP. So how do we keep it relevant? As I've said, understand the policy hierarchy. Emphasize the benefits of your proposed development. It's not simply, this is what we want, this is what we want as developers. What are the wider benefits? Are there benefits towards the local communities there? Are there benefits to other assets? Are there environmental benefits? So again, highlight the positives of that scheme. Any negatives, look to address so that they can be mitigated. As far as possible, try to avoid non-planning issues. Some can creep in, and they can be, and personal issues and things can be considerations, but your focus should be on planning issues and planning policy issues. Collaboration. Share the load, engage with other stakeholders. Again, this is why the early engagement with the local planning authority. Engage with them. If they're on board, life becomes easier. Engage with the community or town council. If they're supportive of a potential scheme, a potential policy change, it's helpful. You get this collaboration. Two voices are stronger than one. Helps also to build an understanding of those planning issues for the future. So when these things come before a community, town council or a local authority, they're aware. It's easier to gather evidence. These bodies will already have their own evidence they're building up. You may be able to use some of this. You won't need to go out and find a housing needs survey for a particular area. You won't need to find what the local community wants in its place plan. If these documents are there, you can gain the benefits of those documents with the collaboration. As I said, sharing knowledge builds a stronger argument, and it gives a greater confidence to the community's views when looking at development, when looking at policy changes that you may be promoting. I know this sounds obvious, but make a strong case. Emphasize what it means for you as the developer, as a community housing scheme. Emphasize those benefits. As I've said, the wider benefits could be that by having a development there means there could be some children. Unusually for probably the UK figure with schools with shortages, some village schools are closing, lack of numbers. Emphasize that there could be this benefit. There could be the benefit to the community in relation to people will go to the pub, people will go to the shop. Add those added benefits. Consider alternatives. Be prepared that someone might go, yeah, but it'd be better if we did this. So don't just neglect those. If it is possible, sort of highlight why your particular development or your policy change is the better option, and an alternative isn't really feasible. I've already touched on use as much of the existing evidence you can find from local authority system, community town council, or other bodies. If you've got flood risk, NRW, if you've got local drainage boards, all these things, collaborating with those groups early on rather than going it alone. If there's gaps, then you need to find that evidence. I'm going to quickly flip past these slides because all they're doing is just a diagrammatic version of saying what I've just said. This just summarizes what the points I just made. Using those research, engaging with others, consider input into place plans. A lot of communities are now going down the road of a place plan. What does that particular community want? So rather than waiting for your LDP to come out, if you are looking for a community housing site on the edge of a village, find out if that village is going down the place plan. Engage in that, because if the community go, great, well, we can put this and we'll look to include it within the place plan, that's going to give greater clout to your arguments and a massive evidence base. Place plans, at the minute in our experience, is one of the few areas of planning that is generating public involvement. People want to be involved. People feel divorced from planning in general, decisions made elsewhere, we don't know what's going on. Place plans has become a mechanism where that top-down approach I outlined earlier suddenly becomes bottom-up. Communities begin to say what we want. So if you can engage in that, brilliant. And that's going to help any cause at an LDP. Keep it focused. There was a colleague who came up with it with this sort of acronym, but there we go. So focus on your key issues. Keep it concise. As much information, but nobody wants to read War and Peace in a submission to a policy or a site allocation or promoting some land. Cover all your points, but keep it sharp and to the point. Keep the structure. Big failing I've seen on both sides, and I've been a private sector planner for many years before I worked with planning. People bounce between, there's this issue and over to that issue, and then we'll talk about highways, or we'll come back to the housing. Think about it. Make sure the structure that is there when you're promoting a site. Evidence base. I'm repeating it. On the next paraphrase, an ex-prime minister. Evidence is the important bit to put behind it. And I think the last one only came because the author of this couldn't think of a D, but diplomatic goes without saying. I think if you open with, I think you're a bunch of idiots if you don't agree with me on this, it's probably not going to at least get you off on the right foot. So understand the constraints they're going under. Who should do it? And that's just, can you do it yourself? Depends on the scale and size and the issue of the scheme. It is possible. You can gather their evidence. There's no reason if it's a community housing scheme, that you can look at it yourself and start to go, But you need to work out, there's a point where you've got to go, these issues are getting beyond me. Is there a wider organisation as part of you? Can someone else within there? If not, do you look to professional consultants, planning consultants, architects, environmental consultants? Trouble with planning these days, when I started in the late 80s, in local authority, sent your plans in, you filled your form in, and the officers looked at it and made a decision. Now, planning has grown over the years almost to become the cure of all ills, and it needs to be accompanied by contamination assessments, flood assessments, heritage assessments, landscape assessments. These are highly technical. If you don't feel you can do it, then I think the advice is, look, can we get a consultant in to work with us? Because by thinking, well, we'll save a couple of pounds because we don't do that, could undermine that case. So the importance is at that point, look at it. But equally, I want to emphasize, you may feel on site, we can do this, and there's no reason. You don't have to pay thousands and thousands of consultants, but you've got to look at the issues of a particular case. I think I'm coming to sum up. My last point is, as Claire announced, this is just 2 pretty pictures of the guide that we helped Wales Cooperative produce. Bilingual guide that also includes information on the Ldp process. So I would strongly advise to look at that. Look at the Welsh Government website. There is a development plans manual. I'm slightly loath to say because it's about 450 pages. Primarily, it's a guide to local authorities. You could find some points in there. Just flip it in, Control F into the PDF and search on a keyword. You may find something useful to back your case. I don't advocate reading the 450 unless you are struggling to sleep one night. But look at that, look at the local authority information, and there'll be plenty of information to build that. And equally, ask organisations such as ourselves, such as Welsh Cooperative as a query, where can we go from here? That's everything from me. The last few slides when you get them are just saying who we are and what we offer. Claire, I'm happy to take questions at that point if time-wise is okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Has anyone got any questions for Mark?
Scare them all off with Ldp.
I think it is. It's a dense process, isn't it? When you start looking at planning, so it takes some time to kind of take things in. But I can see that Joe's been brave and has a question. So I'll hand over to Joe.
Thank you. Yeah, just the strategic development plans, Mark, that you mentioned. Did you say they're in place or they're going to be put in place? And if so, when are the consultations open? Do you know?
Okay, they're going to come in. The legislation is in, right. and it's come in, and as you've seen, the Future Wales policy document further endorses that and sets the 4 regions. There was originally 3 regions, which basically grouped. You had the north towards Wrexham, you had the southeast, and then the rest of Wales, which you suddenly had this enormous region going from probably, I don't know, Welshpool down to St David's. So we've now got 4. Some are starting work. I know the southeast one is progressing at initial stages. In relation to when consultations, at the moment we don't know, because they've got to set up a joint committee. So the authorities within the boundaries of these regions all have to reach agreement on what they're doing, and I imagine that might take a little bit of time on some of them. So the provision is there. As and when they will start, we don't know at the minute. I would think you're going to be looking, particularly where everyone's under Ldp, you'll probably see things moving. I would see the southeast towards mid-late next year, things will start. Possibly northeast Wales around Wrexham. I can imagine. I would have said the West Wales one being slightly quieter, maybe slow, but given that it includes Swansea, Neathport, Talbot, there's some development pressures. So over the next year or so, I think it's a bit of a watch this space at the minute on that one. But it will follow the same process as an Ldp, so it'll take 3-4 years to go through, and there'll be consultation.
Okay, and is it something where we could almost try and get a commitment to community-led housing? So just thinking about what they might look like, is there possibly an option that we could put a case forward that any housing developments that are agreed under the strategic development plan have to give consideration to community-led housing or something along those lines?
Yeah, it's possible. It's certainly possible. In a sense, we're all in a bit of a wait and see what they will finally look like. And I don't think the final guidance has been. The government has promised guidance on what they'll look like. But yeah, I think because what it's going to do is take away this strategic housing element from each authority, and it'll be setting the housing figures and the strategic aims. Now that's going to be pretty general, but I don't see any reason at this stage why that couldn't be explored. Same as Italy. I would say the analogy I'd give is it's going to include probably the percentage you need affordable housing, social housing. Then the same argument could apply there. And I would certainly at this stage say it may well be a vehicle for promoting that at that time, to at least give some flesh on a bone, which you can then expand at the Ldp Lite.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
You're on mute, Claire.
Gosh, I should know that by now, shouldn't I? We've got another question from Griffith. I hope I'm saying your name correctly, and my pronunciation's dreadful sometimes. And we also have a question from Norma in the chat as well.
Dwi'n cael gofyn y cwestiynau yma'n Gymraeg yn tadi hwn just yn Saesneg. Am I allowed to ask these in Welsh or it's just in English?
I can try and translate for you, Griffith, if that's
well, it's okay because it's been lost in translation. I might lose it in translation myself, actually. Yes, thanks for the information there. I've been a member of the planning committee for almost 10 years, and I think that the biggest problem that we face is the jargon associated with the bureaucratic planning process. I mean, everything can be lost, inside this jargon. I have difficulty following what some of these officers are on about. You were talking about place plans. What can you? There's a couple of questions. If you dash answer them afterwards. The place plan. In England you've got Localism Act, and they can go for, I suppose, like a place plan through the Localism Act there. That's one of the questions I'd like to ask. And also, we're talking about the time frame associated with these local development plans, which can be a nightmare because we believe that we've been dragged into a bureaucratic quagmire here up in Gwynedd, where we've got absolutely no chance of changing the policies for another 3.5 years because of the process of going to consultation associated with any change to the plan, which in my reckoning makes it a dead plan and not a living document if you have to go through all that rigmarole again, Surely there's an easy way of doing it, but I think that differently to lots of areas, I reckon we haven't got a housing problem here. There's enough housing here. What we're lacking here is homes, homes for people. You can go through this community land trust and try and build more houses. But I mean, we're in an area of outstanding natural beauty here. The problem is that we got too many second homes. And that's the problem here, not a lack of properties. So those are a few of the things I'm trying to translate in my head here.
Okay. I'll try and go through them all relatively quickly. On the place plans as well, if you pick up from the slides at the end, you just on the email of info to planning, if you just put Mark in front and feel free to email me, we can expand on place plans. Obviously, the place plans being more of a bottom-up approach, local community. You're right, in England, they've got a greater legal status in the planning system, neighbourhood plans in England. They are part of the development plan system and therefore carry weight. In Wales, they're not. The only way that at the present time that a place plan has really any significant weight, should we say, because it'll have weight as a material consideration, is if the council are willing to adopt it as an SPD. It comes in as guidance. It is something we are looking at. It's something the planning area feels strongly about, that the place plans should be given a greater status. And this afternoon, I'm not going to change Welsh policy, Welsh government policy at the moment. That's where we are. So we are different to England on that point at the moment. I would strongly say that, though, that I wouldn't rule that out of anyone pursuing a place plan, because done properly, and the big example we got engaged with is Newtown, which has now been adopted and is part of the Powys SPG now, has worked well and is fitting well in the system. So it is worth, it's better that we at least get it into the system that way until legislation will change whenever, if it ever does, to be similar to England. That said, I could find some fault in the English one, having worked with the English one, some of the neighbourhood plans in England. I think just to get things in, I think if you took the front cover off of the particular neighbourhoods, you'd read the plan and go, I'm not sure which one I'm in. So there can be flaws the other way. So it's getting the balance right. But at the minute, you're right. We're not at the same status as England on that. As I said, if you drop me a line, Griffith, we can go through a lot more. I'll provide you with sort of some guidance on the place plans, other information. Yeah, I think the issue you raised is it is slow, and I think every attempt that has been made, and I wouldn't lay this even at the Welsh government's door, because initially, when it was the England and Wales planning system, the idea was to revise the planning system in the late 90s to speed it up. A whole raft of changes which either didn't speed it up or slowed it down, if you ask me. And it's still the same. It's a slow process. You're right, an LDP, by the time it goes through, time to start is 3-4 years. A lot of the issues have changed. It's difficult. I think if this strategic development plan system does work, and I'm not saying that I would sort of say it's a good or bad thing at the minute. We've got to wait to see. There's a clear fear about large regions and accountability and things that need to be looked at. If it does, and it brings in what's called the Ldp Lite document, which, again, I'm not particularly keen on the name. I think that could be better. It would be a shorter document, which should allow, and they're looking at sort of that taking 2 or 3 years less than a normal LDP to promote. That could be a means of having a more dynamic document. So things may change with that. But you're right, and it's a problem. It's a problem across Wales. It's a problem across England. Speed of the development plan process, and it's getting. There is a conundrum because there's a huge amount of pressure from one side about more consultation, more engagement, and at the other side, more speed. And trying to get, I think at the minute we probably haven't got the balance right of getting an appropriate speed and appropriate consultation to get it moving quicker. So you are right, but things may improve. And on the latter point, I don't think I've much to say. I would agree. I think there are horses for courses. The problems of Gwynedd are not similar to, say, Bridgend, Rhondda, Cynon Taff, where they're faced with the issues of housing from Cardiff. That said, the second home issue is a big issue. I know that is being looked at by Welsh Government, and I know Gwynedd, if I'm correct, have done some significant research on the issue and ideas, and there are potential suggestions about changes to the use class system, changes to the taxation system, etc., to try and address that. But you're right, there are horses for courses, and the LDP system needs to address that. Not sure if that's the answer there, Griffith, but as I said, please feel free to drop me an email, and I'll probably give a longer detail or have a chat if helpful.
Diolch yn fawr.
Thanks, Mark. We've got a couple more questions. So I think as time is getting on, we would actually, a lot of the challenges that people are facing are coming out in the questions, really. So if you're happy, we'll continue and let Simon ask his question next. and then who? I think Joe might have put something in the chat as well, so perhaps we can address that too. Simon, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, yeah. Can you hear me, Mark?
Yes, I got you.
Yeah, I'm afraid my question's also about place plans, really, but also timescales. You know, I take it that place plans laid alongside the UDP. When can a place plan be sort of like put forward? What sort of timescale? And if the local authority does take it on board as being something that they're going to take on as a place plan, can that go? That runs with the UDP as it is now, is it? Or is it something which would be injected into the next unitary development plan?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you've hit a good point. Place plans in the sense of timescales can be as quick as the community who are dealing with them. I think the Newtown example I gave probably, I think it was around 2 years to go from start to finish of the engagement, and was adopted earlier this year by Powys. Key point, I think, in a place plan getting adopted, which speeds the process up, is getting the local authority on board from the start. If they're part of that process as you're going through your community engagement, putting together the place plan, it becomes a lot swifter at their end because it's something they're part of, they've been part of. So that can speed it up there. So it can be quick. The drawback, you've probably hit the drawback, is the place plan can't go contrary to the development plan policy. And it's a point I probably could have mentioned it at all, is the difficulty we got with all these plans. It's a fantastic, and the system in my head is a fantastic system if we all start on baseline 0, but we don't, and they're all at different stages. So a place plan being carried out, let's pick Powys, for example, which is recently adopted, would need to be complying with the adopted policies in Powys at the minute to be given any SPG. It could, rather than solely a document to influence the next replacement plan. Certainly, there's no reason why issues can't. What you can find through the place plan process that would help as a replacement plan. So picking another authority, maybe what off the top of my head as well as Bridgend, which has still got adopted, but we're now moving towards replacement there, would be the evidence you gather in your place plan, even though you couldn't be looking at policy changes that are contrary to the LDP. That evidence you gather in building your place plan could be excellent evidence to be put into the LDP to influence the next LDP. But strictly speaking, at the minute, the way the structure is, the place plan must, in a sense, be subservient to the LDP. So you couldn't look at policy changes. So there is a bit of a conflict that can arise. But as I said, the process of preparing a place plan can be a benefit in consultations on the LDP.
Okay, okay.
Great, thanks, Simon. I think Joe was asking about whether or not the strategic development plan can be used to dictate the number or percentage of second homes allowed in an area due to the detrimental impact that they have on some communities and the culture of that community. And in order to sort of safeguard them for the future, is that a realistic goal that we could try and get in there? And Joe's more than welcome to pitch in if I haven't got that question quite right, if I haven't interpreted it right.
Yeah, I think it was just more in response as well to Griffith's points that he made earlier. Just, I know it won't change the current situation, but in terms of maybe a starting point and safeguarding future generations in the communities, could that sort of thing be put into the strategic development plans?
Possibly. I'm more inclined to think it'll come at the Ldp Lite in that sort of detail. I think if the strategic development plan at least provides some sort of broad recognition of the role it can play in relation to the housing, and certainly you would expect North West Wales's strategic development plan issues, as I said, probably to identify second homes as a major issue. I expect the West Wales one, the South West Wales, Pembrokeshire are experiencing similar issues, and to a degree, certain part of West Carmarthenshire and parts of Ceredigion. So when you get to that next stage, then yes, there is that. It filters into that argument. There's a difficult position with the second homes argument at the minute is in planning terms. There's no planning designation of second homes. So if I went up to, I don't know, Betws-y-Coed, bought a house, I could live down in, where I am now on the edge of Carmarthenshire and just keep it vacant because that's my second home. You can't. There's nothing to stop me. Because planning system. I think that's what's being looked at. There needs to be this, particularly in these areas, this broader brush. And one of the arguments that's being looked at, where the community housing could filter in and support those arguments, is to looking at a use category similar to houses in multiple occupation, where the government has moved now, and originally you could go into dwelling house as C3, it's in was HMO. They introduced the C4 use class for large HMOs because of the issues they generated. That's one of the thoughts that's being considered. Could it be done? And I think the community housing angle could filter in and benefit that, because I think there's a role to play that community housing can contribute to providing homes for future generations. So that's a major plus. But I think that could also bolster the argument of how you would address this second homes situation. It is a difficult one because there's lots coming from the other side as well, sort of saying, well, property rights, I'm entitled in government policy. I think since the late 70s was everybody to buy their homes. And I think it's sort of, well, I bought the home, it's mine, why should I can do with it what I want. And I think that's the problem planning is finding. How does it provide a satisfactory framework without treading on seen as individual property rights, to find a workable solution. But I think the point, if I've answered it right, is yes, I think there's a role to play. Community housing as a community housing can have a major role in that, but I think it'll be more at Ldp stage, Ldp Lite stage, on breaking down figures.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Has anyone got any more questions before we draw things to a close?
Do you want me to pick up a few that were in the chat there?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what I'm happy to talk the email afterwards. I'm not sure I can answer anything immediate on the Machynlleth plan. I haven't got a grasp on that, but more than somebody wants to throw, fire the query to us afterwards, and I can look in and give some comments. It's fine. There was one about strategic development. Technically, no. Will strategic development plans have an effect on LDPs already approved? No. Effectively, what will happen is if the plan is not already, if an SDP is adopted, which is going to be 5 years plus down the road by the time they start anyway, and an LDP is adopted, then that will probably be a ground for a replacement LDP, because it'll supersede the housing part, because it'll be a more up-to-date policy. So the rest of the plan will either, if the authority feels they could divorce those structures, and fine, the original plan will still have validity. But what we'll probably find is more go down the route of a replacement Ldp Lite once the SDP is in. I think that's it. Is that it?
Yeah, Mark, I was wondering if I could ask another question. Sorry.
Fine for me if I'm allowed. Yeah, I'm free for the afternoon. Well, I shouldn't say that. I'm here till 6.
Yeah, I was just thinking that if the new local development plan is just being undertaken now, it's going to take 4 or I don't know, maybe more years to undertake. If a place plan can be adopted by the county council and it can be sorted out and adopted within 2 years, that's a faster track, quite possibly. I know it's got to agree with the local development plan that's there already, but I was wondering, as far as sort of like the local settlements around where I'm in a fairly rural area, the plans are drawn up, so like the actual plans where development land could be undertaken. These place plans could redefine that, or could they, or is it possible to sort of like denote development plan areas which are alongside development land at the moment, or near to, or denote totally new bits of development land?
A place plan can't, in the sense if a settlement boundary has been defined within the local, the LDP, and is shown on the proposals map, it's black line drawn around where it is, which in some cases can be the last building on the edge of the village and zigzag around, it's drawn so tightly, then no, the place plan can't say we'll be looking for housing, or having its policy there will be housing outside that. It has to sort of follow similar. As I said, it could look at it under the exceptions policy. So again, if you're looking at community housing, there may be the argument that it could fit that debate, and it could be the argument of that's a suitable site for exceptions housing policy. I think on the scenario you've outlined would be is if there was evidence to back up the development of a site outside the boundary, then it's gathering that ready for the next review with the LDP, with the local authority, unfortunately, would be my view. If a site is included, or if you've got land included with the place plan, then the place plan certainly, and it hasn't been developed, the place plan may well have a role of suggesting what can and can't go within the allocated, carry a little bit of status there. But yes, if the fixed flat line is in or out, if it's out, then the place plan can't allocate that site and say this is where we want the housing for the village, not on the other side of the line, etc. That would be a battle for another day, unfortunately.
Yeah, and the first question, sorry, you know, if it takes 2 years to do a local, a place plan, then it's going to take 4 or 5 years for the new UDP to come through. A place plan could be a fast track, relatively.
It can, but so the constraint in the way it's there now is because it can't go contrary to the LDP. So whilst that other LDP is that the replacement is taking 4 years to adopt, the adopted one is still in place, the one that might be 10 years old or whatever. So that's the difficulty. So the authority are not going to to give the place plan a greater status in the system as SPG. The authority aren't going to want to endorse it as SPG if it's flying contrary to the development plan as is. And I think in the sense of how it would affect the replacement plan, merging, if the authority were minded to agree, then it's likely in those early discussions with the authority, they'll be suggesting sort of holding fire on the place plan until the replacement LDP progresses to include that. But as I said, it depends on where stage the replacement LDP is. If the evidence that was gathered on the place plan is overwhelming for additional site, then certainly that overwhelming evidence should be put to the authority to look to review the LDP when they're reviewing it, to be looking to include those sites. But that's why I'm saying the sort of place plan work, whilst it can't change it, could still have an influence on an emerging LDP. But I think strictly in the scenario of given, it could, even though it's quicker on 2 years, it couldn't allocate a site that the current plan isn't allocated.
No, okay, thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so it's almost 3 o'clock, so we're going to draw things to a close, but you've got Mark's details there, and we will circulate the slides so that you've got all of the detail, and we'll send a link to our planning guide for community-led housing as well. Just to do a quick plug, we've still got events happening as part of the CLH Fest. So we've got Co-ops Night tonight, which is hosted by one of my colleagues, Alan Shepherd, looking at student housing co-ops and also financing housing cooperatives. And I would say that the financing element would be relevant across all parts of community-led housing, not just housing cooperatives, but all models. And then tomorrow we have a panel discussion, which is being attended by Julie James. So you may have questions that you want to put to her and other members of the panel. And we also have a session tomorrow afternoon about sustaining Welsh communities, and it's likely, knowing that the second homes issue has come up today, that's going to be discussed tomorrow as well. And I think I'm right in thinking that that session will have a translator, so it'll be Welsh language first, I believe, but we have tested the translation and it works really smoothly. So if you're not a Welsh speaker, then please do come along as well. But seeing the topic and the areas, we wanted to have that session in Welsh. So do please come along, and Casey's posted the links in the chat. But just to say thank you for Mark, I think we did away with the breakout groups, so he answered a lot more questions than we originally intended, and we're really grateful for your time today. But I'll let everyone get on with their afternoons, and hopefully the rain's clearing up where you are. It slowly seems to be brightening up where I am, which the dog would be happy for, because she's barely been walked the last couple of days. So I'll let you get on with your afternoon, and hopefully see you at some of our sessions later today or tomorrow. Take care all. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.